welcome everybody to our webinar today. Really good to see some good numbers coming online for us. Got really great number signed up for today's webinar, so good to see some interest in what happened at COP. It was certainly an interesting couple of weeks. Maybe we start with some introductions. So joined today by two wonderful people. We've got Rod Oram, who many of you will know, and we've got Kanika Jhunjhnuwala. Sorry, I stumbled over that a little bit with my jet lag, who works for Sedima Hotels, who attended COP as well. So maybe I'll get both of you to just briefly introduce yourselves and let us know what you are hoping to get out of attending COP this year. It's quite the investment of time and money, so I'm sure you both went with some goals in mind. Rod, maybe we start with you.
Well, kia ora tato. Great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Belinda, for inviting me. Lovely to see you too, Kanika too. So thank you. I hope to get out of COP each year just a whole lot of new ideas and a new learning. I try not to be too invested in a journalist in saying, well, it'd be great if we get this, and it'd be great if we get that, because I'm there essentially as a reporter. That's a bit disingenuous because I've obviously got strong feelings of my own. And as more of a columnist than a news writer these days, I do bring my judgments to the pieces I write. So having said that, I was obviously looking for a very big progress of some kind on fossil fuels. I knew the language was going to be difficult, as it was. But I was also very excited that this is the first COP that nature and agriculture and food had any kind of prominence. They had theme days in themselves, because each day there's a theme of the day, usually a number of elements. So nature was coupled with water, a subset of nature, obviously, and food and agriculture were sharing with something else. I can't remember what it was. But because nature and nature-based solutions to our escalating climate crisis are two of our very strong suits here in New Zealand, and indeed agriculture being so important to our economy, that was a particular focus. So those are my main interests.
Great, thanks, Rod. And what about you, Kanika?
Kia ora. I went with the idea of, so it was my first COP, and honestly it was overwhelming because of the size of it and just the difficulty I found of like navigating the whole entire space. But I think what I wanted to get out of it was to get some inspiration and just get an idea of where New Zealand stands in the global scale of things, as well as what is happening within the climate change space globally. And I think my main interests around that obviously is in the tourism sector as part of the hotels. And I think the other part of it that I got out of it was a lot in the urbanization space, because hotels obviously means that you're urbanizing areas. And also just getting some really cool insights from some really amazing speakers who I had either heard of before or never heard of before that. So yeah, I think it was just all around inspiration for me, and a bit of like also understanding what is going on in the global context.
Yeah, brilliant. And it was massive, wasn't it? It was completely overwhelming. I went last year for the first time. I know Rod's been to a number of COPs now, but walking from one side to another for presentations or all those sorts of things. I had one day that I had to walk from one side to the other 5 times because of the way my schedule worked out, and it was about 1,500 steps from one side to the other. So I worked out that I'd walked about 120 kilometers during the time I was at COP. So yeah, quite the benefit for my health, I suppose, apart from the air quality while we were there. So I guess we're gathering today at a pretty critical point in time, just after COP, and what everybody's wondering is, whether COP was a success or a failure, because depending on what you read, you're hearing both at the moment. So, we got an agreement that did mention fossil fuels for the first time ever, mentioned what the private sector can do, mentioned things like nature and food security and those sorts of things, again, for the first time ever. But with that, some sides are saying it wasn't strong enough, it wasn't firm enough in terms of the actions that are required. So we're going to be talking about some of those things, and just to get some perspectives on what we feel about success or failure, both inside the negotiations, but also in all the other things that were going on. There were over 300 pavilions at COP, and just in the limited blue zone area, and so there were 300 different things going on at any given time, and then there was a public area that was 4 times the size of the blue zone. So a heap going on, but and so whether it was a success or a failure really depends on what you saw and what you were aiming to get out of it, I suppose. So Rod, maybe you could start with whether you see COP as a success or a missed opportunity for global climate action, or maybe somewhere in between.
I'd like to start, if I may, with just repeating a key thing about COP. Because it has 198 countries as signatories, and every decision has to be unanimous, because over almost 30 years of COPs, they've never been able to agree on a rule book for how to run COPs. It was Saudi Arabia, right from the very first COP, that refused to, in particular, held out against agreeing on a voting mechanism, say a supermajority. And that's why everything has to be a consensus agreement. So you can't possibly get anything immensely challenging through COP. And so it's not the place to look for the leading edge. You can find leading edge players there, but you can't expect COP itself, in aggregate, all 198 countries to be the leading edge. But I don't think that matters at all, because I think there's a really important thing about that unanimous agreement. Because then when things start to bed down in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a whole bunch of work streams then develop under each of those new concepts agreed. So, for example, on nature, it was very hard to progress that this year, and hard to get to, and only achieved a rudimentary first global goal on adaptation, because the negotiators realized very early on there just weren't the metrics for measuring resilience of an ecosystem, for example, in a consistent way. So now there's a whole bunch of work agreed to fast forward that before the next COP. So the Framework Convention is terribly important for that commonality of goals and structure, and then all the work streams that happen underneath it. So I think it was a very good COP in many respects. We'll obviously come back in detail to the fossil fuels in due course. But there was still a real imbalance, because it was not just developed countries, but a handful of big, powerful ones that really were pushing for a certain set of outcomes. And those outcomes could have done, should have done a lot more for developing countries, but didn't. So in that respect, it's all very well to commit to various things, but COP has got to get an awful lot better at delivering the support to developing countries that they need to be able to then respond to those agreements. And so COP was weak on that side, for example. But overall, there's a good range of issues in the UAE consensus, as it's called, to sit alongside the Paris Agreement. I thought an awful lot had been achieved. It's not enough, it's not fast enough, it's all of those things. But it was a very big step up from Sharm el-Sheikh last year, and even from Glasgow the year before. So it was more productive, in a sense, than a lot of recent COPs. I mean, the one before Glasgow, there wasn't one because there was COVID. Glasgow should have been 2020. And before that was, gosh, I think Madrid, which went way over time, I think about 3 days or 4 days, and produced very little. So on the benchmark of all those, this COP got through a lot of work and made some good decisions.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth noting that COP is treated like it's an event, but actually it's a process. There's a whole lot of work happens between COPs on preparing recommendations, doing the technical work, those sorts of things. So I know that, for example, our negotiators have been involved in a whole lot of stuff in between COPs to get ready and to maximise what can be achieved when everybody is in the same room effectively.
Yeah, there was a wonderful quote from Bill McKibben, the veteran and very effective US journalist and climate campaigner, who said COP is the scorecard, it's not the game. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And as the scorecard goes, it was pretty decent. And I think that helps us understand what COP means.
Yeah, there's another quote that I heard towards the end of it, and I can't remember who said it. It might have been Simon Steele, but saying, watch the movie, not just the snapshot. So it's sort of watching the process over time, look at the whole picture and the direction we're going and the speed we're going at, rather than focusing on a particular thing. And I think that's probably quite important as well.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I just want to add to that is maybe if you think of COP as like the whole process and then what like all of those 198 countries have decided together, it kind of signals the direction that the world is heading in. So you can have like that's the lowest common denominator that they've all decided on. So you'll have countries that are doing much more than that. You'll have countries, but nobody can do worse than that. So I think it's definitely heading in the right direction. And it doesn't mean that within New Zealand we can't do better than that and we can't accelerate as businesses, as people, as government. So I think that's also another important thing to keep in mind. And what you said about the funding also, I think when I was at COP, I was hearing numbers like 100 million, 200 million, and I was thinking, oh wow, that's a huge number. But then you think about the scale of it and the scale globally, and that's a drop in the bucket. That's like when you think of the percentage that actually means for the funding for the loss and damage stuff, it's like 0.2% of like what they make in their, I don't know, annual. Yeah, so I think the scale of what that is quite relevant once you start thinking about it in percentages.
Yeah, absolutely. I follow a podcast called Outrage and Optimism, which is Christine Figueres and some other people, and they released one during COP, and the way Christina Figueres described it is government set direction and minimum speed of travel, and recognizing that that's the minimum, not the limit, is really important for us to remember. So there were a whole lot of announcements and initiatives and global cooperations and things that were announced during COP. Interested to understand what you were following and what your thoughts were around how they contribute to, COP as a success or otherwise. Don't mind who starts.
Do you want to go first?
You can start.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, I will obviously start with fossil fuels. The idea that there would be very explicit language about a phase out of fossil fuels, I thought was very unrealistic, because there's a lot of fossil fuel producers that don't even want the word fossil fuels there. They say they don't want phase out. And I was actually relatively relaxed. That isn't quite the right word. I was going to give the UAE as hosts and Sultan Al Jaber as president the benefit of the doubt to see how they performed, because I knew that the UAE had got really high marks for the diplomatic role it's been playing over the last 2 years as it's built up to this COP. And one diplomat I spoke to, who's a veteran of COPs and whose opinion I think is very, I think his judgment's very fine, said that actually in that political lead up, the UAE was as good as, almost as good as the UK. So I had some high hopes there, but I also thought that it would probably take a petrostate to be able to talk to petrostates, and a chief executive of an oil company as Al Jaber is to be able to talk to others, and therefore try to be a bit more persuasive. So I think the language we've ended up with about a transition is fine, but it has an awful lot, and the phrase has been widely used, loopholes in it. So it talks about transition fuels, which is obviously seized on particularly by gas producers, which is the last thing we need. And it also leaves open the scope for carbon capture, use and storage, which the technology really doesn't exist. It does pretty well at the production end of fossil fuels, but not obviously at the consumer end, the burn end of them. So it is weak. However, and it's also weak in some other respects, because it should have more strongly differentiated between developed countries that have achieved a massive amount of development and wealth by using fossil fuels versus developing countries that haven't yet had that chance and shouldn't need that chance. They should be able to leapfrog to renewables instead. But also those developing countries were obviously going to move on fossil fuels more slowly than developed countries and need more help to do that. And so I think it was weak on that. But I hope, and this has obviously been widely expressed by the UAE and the UNFCCC Executive Secretary itself, Simon Steele, that this does send a very clear signal to countries who are required by the Paris Agreement to produce their next set of nationally determined contributions, their climate commitments in 2025. And so this is going to steer them more strongly on that transition away from fossil fuels. I guess the two market indicators that I'd be looking for is whether we start to see any fossil fuel companies return to a bigger share of, at the moment it's only a minuscule money on R&D and CapEx into clean technology and clean energy. But if we see any shift back, because they had moved back towards fossil fuels in the last few years. But then crucially, whether, and this to me is the more important one, is whether market capitalization of fossil fuel companies are going to be rethought by analysts. They're going to go, ooh, actually, maybe these companies won't be burning as much fuel as they thought they would. And therefore, we're going to knock back their CapEx, their market cap quite a bit. So those are the two key things I'm looking for over the next, say, 6 months on market capitalization, and perhaps over the next year or two on CapEx and R&D spend, just to see if this is going to bring any kind of shift in strategy for the fossil fuel producers themselves.
Yeah, and interestingly, the International Energy Agency believes that fossil fuel use has already peaked. So the development of new fossil fuel, I guess, generation and those sorts of things should be looked at with some, with that in mind, that actually we may have a whole lot available, but if the consumption's reducing, then you might end up with stranded assets and things anyway. Kanika, were there any announcements or initiatives that you were particularly following?
Not particularly, but just around that, the thing that I found interesting, because this was the first year where they had a health themed day, was I went to a couple of those talks, and I think the thing that stood out to me most was how intertwined climate change is with health, not just in terms of like the changing climate, but also in terms of like if we're relying on fossil fuels, the actual particulate matter that ends up in the atmosphere because of that, not just the carbon. So one of the things that I think that I probably didn't realize before was, even with carbon capture and storage, it only captures the carbon. It doesn't capture the rest of the emissions that come out with it, which is like the particulate matter, which can really affect populations at large. So I think what I'm starting to realize is how complex and how big the whole entire scale of climate change is, and how it affects like literally everything that we're thinking about. So we do need to act, and we need to do it quite quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there were about 127 different initiatives and announcements during COP, so it was really hard to follow all of them. And some of them weren't relevant to New Zealand anyway, because they were quite specific to individual countries and those sorts of things. A couple that I noted, I guess, that were, good sign for me was a couple that were around cooperation and harmonisation and those sorts of things, which was a bit of a theme that I saw through COP. One was the International Sustainability Standards Board has committed to be working with ISO to make sure that they're aligning where it's appropriate to do so, and interestingly aligning with ISO 14001, which is the Environmental Management Systems Standard. So recognising the synergies between those two, and also the 6 biggest carbon credit issuers have agreed to work together to make sure that they're all aligned on what quality means and those sorts of things, to make sure that that voluntary carbon market is always improving its integrity over time. So there were quite a number of those sorts of things going on during COP as well. So moving on to decarbonisation, which is really what this is all about. Kanika, in your role at Sedima Hotels, have you noticed any emerging trends or initiatives related to decarbonisation within the private sectors, and or anything that came out at COP that you could relate to in terms of the things that you're seeing in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, so basically in my day-to-day work, we get a lot of, we do a lot of RFPs, so we bid for a lot of work. And what we're seeing is more and more people are asking us about our carbon emissions, about our water usage, about what we're doing around modern slavery, just because those are the things that they need to take off before they can stay in a place or like commercially start working with a business. And I think at one of the meetings I was talking to somebody who said that the same was true for the agriculture sector, where if they want to deal with, I think it was Waitrose or somebody from the UK, that they would have to make sure that they have all of this data available and ready. Otherwise, from X date, they're no longer able to supply them. So I think these things are moving in business as well, and it's going to be a slow trickle down. The other thing that I did notice was in the tourism sector, the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance. I went to a panel with him in it, and the CEO of that, he mentioned that what they're seeing in Europe is that people are starting to have the willingness to pay more for more sustainable hospitality options, which is not what we're seeing in New Zealand yet, but it's a good signal that it's going to come. So I think that there's a lot of hope and a lot of positives that have come out of that global outlook as well, and the way that people are starting to think, and the way that they're starting to vote with their wallets as well. So hopefully we'll see that in New Zealand soon.
Yeah, I think it's starting to come in pockets. You're hearing survey results that people are saying that they're looking at those things. Whether they are in reality, who knows? But there definitely seems to be a change in appetite.
Yeah, and I think also because New Zealand is like New Zealand tourism is more of a nature-based experience. The research that Kantar produced meant that they said that people are happy to pay more for those nature-based experiences to be more in line with nature and to be more sustainable, but not for something where like they're renting a car or staying in a hotel, unless it's somehow going to be linked into nature as well, and it like changes their experience completely. So it is something that we need to be thinking about quite a bit.
Yeah, and there was quite a lot of talk about what they described as the climate nature nexus. At the moment we've got a separate biodiversity COP and climate COP, but actually they really overlap massively. And there was a bit of talk about, well, should they be separate or should they be together? Because you just can't separate nature and climate, because, you know, we are all part of nature when it comes down to it. Rod, have you got any insights along those or in those areas?
Well, just briefly on that last point, this cover agreement, the overall text at the end, did start to make linkages with the biodiversity COP, which is good. But I think it would be a mistake to bring them to actually completely merge them, because they're both dealing with a lot of very complex issues, and they need the time and space to do that. If in essence biodiversity just became, albeit a very big work stream within COP, I think it would lose some of that capacity, some of that ability to drill down. Definitely linkages, definitely bringing the concepts very closely together, but keep a lot of the work somewhat separate. The agriculture was interesting because this is the first time the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization had produced a roadmap to sort of net zero food by 2050. But it was quite disappointing in a couple of respects. First of all, it was pretty skeletal. Secondly, there's been a huge blockage in the FAO in terms of culture. There's been the people doing animal agriculture have been a bit of a fiefdom there, and although they have done some good reports like the long shadow of livestock a number of years ago, they're still, from what I hear, a bit too close to the major meat packing companies and meat farming companies in the world. And so meat wasn't fully integrated into that overall roadmap to net zero 2050. So the FAO's got a lot more work to do on that. Then there's other branches of the United Nations, like the United Nations Environment Programme, had a report that came out during COP called What's Cooking? And it was looking at new food technologies, i.e., precision fermentation and cellular agriculture and the rest. And I thought it was really interesting. It was coming from UNEP, but again, the FAO itself is still rather more focused on trying to get incremental improvement out of existing farming systems rather than dealing with the big system change that needs to happen in food and farming. They know the issues, they do talk about the themes, but I don't think they're giving anywhere near strong enough signals. So as a result of that, if I now bring all that much closer to home, the Global Dairy Platform represents major dairy businesses, almost entirely in developed countries. It was founded by Fonterra in about 2006, when Andrew Ferrier was chief executive. And it's finally getting quite a lot going on its pathways to dairy net zero. But their emphasis is again on incremental improvements in farming systems, particularly in developed countries, because they say that's where almost all the growth's coming from, but that's where a high proportion of emissions are coming from. And that's where we think we developed nations should be helping that. And I said, well, yes, but you've got to be far more ambitious about your own emissions, because your license to keep operating ruminant animals, farming ruminant animals, and if you don't deal with the methane far faster than you're dealing with, and dealing with it in wholesome ways rather than sort of chemical interventions in terms of vaccines and the like, I think you're going to run out of road. You're going to, lose consumers. And so overall, from the FAO down, agriculture, the really big ideas in agriculture are being driven not by the United Nations, not by big businesses in general, with a few exceptions like Nestle, There's still too much emphasis on incremental progress. So to me, agriculture is a real weakness. That's certainly true here in New Zealand, when we could be, we have this fantastic opportunity to have a very big change in farming systems. So they are truly a nature-based solution, rather than our biggest source of emissions in New Zealand. Fonterra alone and its farmers are responsible for 21% of our emissions. Agriculture is the sector that worries me, I think, the most globally, and it worries me very considerably in a New Zealand context.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rod. Certainly New Zealand's quite unusual in developed countries in terms of our footprint, and we all know that, but it gives us both an opportunity and a responsibility, I guess, to be trying to take a lead in those spaces. So another one for you, Rod, which I'm sure you'll probably quite enjoy answering. Keen to get your insights on New Zealand's role, achievements, and areas for improvement in the global context. Do you think the outcomes position New Zealand as a leader in climate action, or do we have work to do?
No, we've got huge work to do. We are a rather mute signatory. We signed up to a whole bunch of stuff, but there was very little in the way of statements or stirring rhetoric. And yes, this was a very new climate minister who'd only been sworn in with his cabinet colleagues a few days before he got on the plane. And so there is, that it was unfortunate transition time between governments for this COP. But having said that, we were very quiet with the last government too. And although we're getting pretty much state-of-the-art advice out of our Climate Change Commission, which I think is very good at its job, the previous government, the Labour-led government, was just losing momentum horribly on all that and not dealing with issues in big enough, bold enough ways. And what we know from the campaign promises of the national-led government and its two ACT and New Zealand First alongside, we're going to go backwards. Three of the main useful mechanisms that are at work now, National is planning to stop doing. So we are absolutely not a leader. We were invisible at COP. Now we have very good officials who play their very good traditional role in negotiations about being honest brokers, clear to deal with, very smart, and helping to find consensus and build consensus and all of that kind of stuff. So we're valued at that level. And once Watts gets some more experience as a climate minister, he might start to get, in a few COPs' time, some work stream chairing roles in the way that James Shaw had. But we are astonishingly low profile, and our small population is absolutely no excuse for that, because we've got other countries of a very similar size of population to us, notably Scandinavian countries, but others, that are very prominent at COP. And yeah, so as I say, I think New Zealand's invisible. The last time, I'll give you two examples of how we've been good in the past. The first one was Copenhagen 2009, which was overall a disaster, but John Key took the idea of the Pastoral Greenhouse Gas Research Consortium to COP in Copenhagen that year. And that got started, and it's doing really, really good work. Then the whole concept of nationally determined contributions was an idea that originally came out of the Pacific Climate Conference. And then Tim Grosser, in a national-led government, was a very engaged climate minister, obviously very experienced, because his whole background professionally before going to politics was in trade negotiations. And Grosser did a really important job of helping work up that idea, which became the heart of the Paris Agreement. So that's what we've done in the past, but we haven't done for a long time.
I think we certainly have the capability within New Zealand to be doing a lot more, so it'd be great to see more happening.
Yeah, and it's not just from government. You know, business, civil society have all got to think bigger, be more ambitious, move faster. There are businesses and civil societies moving far faster than us.
I agree. It was interesting this year, it was the first year that the government has enabled what they call party overflow contingent, which is effectively the government being able to provide some passes to COP for businesses, NGOs, civil society, and they went through quite an open process for people to be able to apply for those. And that's how both Kanika and I got to attend this year. And I think that was really positive. I think that did give a lot of New Zealanders, there were about 100 of us using those sorts of badges, I believe. You know, we got to participate in some panels. We got to talk about some of the cool things that are going on here. Unfortunately, New Zealand doesn't have its own pavilion to be able to do that in a central place. So we were doing it all around COP. Kanika, have you got any thoughts around whether New Zealand's a leader in the space that you're working in?
Yeah, so I actually went and spoke to the UNWTO, which is UN's arm of the tourism organization. And when I was like, hey, I'm from New Zealand, they were like, you're doing really well. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, it's good to already have that reputation built. But at the same time, I also am very aware that we haven't signed on to the UNWTO Glasgow Declaration, and we haven't done any of the stuff which signals to the rest of the world that we are a part of that global movement to improve the tourism industry. But I think what we've been doing, aside from that, was pretty powerful enough for them to take notice. So, for example, I know that before the change in government, I was involved with the leadership group for the tourism environment phase of the industry transformation plan, which was quite a big piece of work, looking at how do we transform the tourism industry, keeping in mind the 1.5 degrees that we need to achieve. That work has been stopped right now, which is just a change in government thing. So we'll just see what happens with it. But it's things like that that makes the whole industry kind of come together and think about what we need to achieve and what we need to do going forward. So I think those ideas will still continue. And I think that's what, when I went and spoke to the UNWTO, that's what they were kind of picking up on as well.
Thanks. So before we open the floor for questions, and I see we've got quite a number of really good questions in there, just keen to briefly reflect on the overall theme of the discussion today and get perspective from each of you on, you know, based on the experiences and the discussions that you had at COP, are you leaning towards it being considered a success or a flop? So maybe we start with Kanika this time.
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I think personally, I definitely got a lot out of it in terms of just making connections, getting a bigger understanding of what's happening, things, and just getting to see a couple of people who I never would have seen speak in panels in New Zealand. But I think also, like, New Zealand could be doing a lot more. But I think at the same time, what Rod mentioned at the beginning, that this is a global consensus, basically, is a signal that it doesn't have to be leading edge, but it is signaling to the world the direction that we're moving in. So I think it's a good thing and a bad thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Kanika.
If we are realistic about what sort of language on fossil fuels petro states were going to go along with, I think this was a good COP. I think that again, never enough, but it could have been, but it is a really good start. And those skeletal on agriculture and nature, that's a good start. But I think the thing that impressed me overall was, I just felt from lots of people I talked to, people I'd never met before, that there was an even greater burning ambition about all this. A greater determination, a greater sense that time really is running out. And so I felt there was not just an energy, but a more productive energy than I was feeling at the last two COPs. That's a ridiculous statement to make, because I'm, only talked to a selective sample that was not even around Igera in the huge number of delegates there. Yeah, I felt good about that.
Yeah, I think going back to that energy, one of the things that I didn't realize was that there were going to be protests within the Blue Zone. And I think those, that was my favorite part of the day, walking into COP, seeing who was protesting today. And it was all the same message. They were saying, we need to go faster. You need to think about us. We need to get rid of fossil fuels. You need to think about 1.5 more seriously. So I think that was the energy, the youthful energy, and just people talking really from their hearts and emotively about what's happening in their own local areas, in their own villages, in their own towns, in their countries. It was just, that was the energy that I think maybe I was feeling as well.
Yes, I mean, one agricultural dinner, I sat next to a young woman who's a farmer in Uganda, and across the other side of the table, and this was a young woman, female farmer from Zimbabwe, and this was a global food thing. It wasn't like an African food dinner, and I just thought it was wonderful they were there. And another interesting example from a civil society point of view, the faiths of the world actually had a faith pavilion for the first time, which you have seen strategically placed at a major intersection, and a pavilion that looked quite different from all the others. It was quite angular and pointing up to the sky rather than just a blocky office building, as so many of the others were. And in past COPs, they've just had to use press conference rooms largely to get their message across. And there's some really powerful stuff there about just transitions, not just for developing countries, but within developed countries with people's lives. Obviously, big emphasis on nature and the rest. So it was good to see those organizations having a chance to blossom quite a bit more, I think, than past COPs.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess my perspective, I think the negotiations part was as successful as we could have hoped it to be. Disappointing that some specific things like Article 6 that we were hoping would get settled didn't get settled again. But some good work's been done in the right directions, I think, there. But so the negotiations part, I think we could call a success, but I definitely felt that the size of the COP, the number of people that were there, really meant that we got to listen to voices we don't normally get to hear. I popped into one session just briefly because I had a bit of spare time. I thought, I wonder what's happening in the Nordic pavilion, because I was walking past. And it was two Nordic people interviewing a guy from the Philippines. And they were saying, he was talking about the actual on-the-ground climate change, what it feels like in the Philippines. And they were going, we're not feeling that. We don't see that. We're not experiencing that yet. So it's really easy for us to kind of not have that perspective on it. And us being here in New Zealand, we are starting to see it. So we've got that experience of having experienced Cyclone Gabrielle and some other severe weather events, but parts of the world aren't seeing it yet, which is interesting. So even just those opportunities to talk to different people, hear different perspectives, but that overarching vibe of let's do this thing, later's too late, let's get on with it, I think for me did make it a success. We have got quite a number of questions come through, so maybe we go through and deal with some of those. So the first one from Adam: with so much going on and being so large, did you find you missed out on some key sessions? For me, yes, it was really hard to two things. It was hard to find out what was going on because there was no central program.
Yeah,
and
I'm completely
very
relaxed
spread
about
out.
this. I mean, the
You can only do
last
one at a
thing
time.
you should never ever take to a COP is fear of missing out. You've got to strike this balance of having a reasonably clear idea of what you're trying to do each day, but then be really open to serendipity about walking around the corner into an interesting meeting or talking to people. And if you hear about something that was wonderful, ask a few questions about it and get the gist of it, but don't go, oh, I really wish I'd been there, because you've got to row your own boat through this. And like any good paddler, you've got to paddle slightly faster than the current in order to have some navigation, to be able to navigate through this. Yeah, there's just this unbelievable amount of stuff, but there's now, of course, this vast amount of stuff, sessions online that are recorded, not just on the official program, but there were so many side events out in the city zone, not just the blue zone negotiations and the green zone more widely for the public, and kind of like this huge number of major international organizations, whether they be business or research institutes or whatever. There's just this unbelievable treasure trove of resources out there, and one could never possibly be bored or doubt that there's something useful for you to listen to out there.
Yeah, and it's also really hard to find out what the programming is in the pavilions as well as in the green zones. So one of the things I actually did was just start Googling people that I might want to see. Yeah. Like, are they coming to COP? Will they be on a panel somewhere? And that's actually how I ended up in the green zone. There was a discussion with Vandana Shiva, who's from India. She's a physicist turned ecofeminist, and she basically works on food webs and how to deindustrialize agriculture. And so she set up her own charity called Navdanya, which is basically re-educating farmers how to get out of the Monsanto and industrialized way from when the Green Revolution happened in India, and how to start farming in the way that they used to, where they're using more organic, biodynamic permaculture sort of practices. So it was quite amazing going and seeing her, because just the way that she talked and she said the message was quite inspiring for me. Yeah.
I must admit, I did hang around the main place where press conferences were for a very long time, past the due time that Antonio Guterres was due to arrive and make some comments. And he is just so extraordinary as Secretary General of the UN, in the extraordinary clarity that he brings to the issues. And I'd never seen him live before, so I was doing a bit of a fanboy thing there, hanging out to hear Guterres live.
Okay, so a sort of related question from Brian. Does the increasing size of COP each year in terms of participants and scope mean that more progress is being made? How do observers determine if things are moving at the necessary speed? Anybody like to deal with that one?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really good international organizations out there, and some particular people. There's a climate scientist in Australia, Simon Evans, who has this uncanny knack of being able to I mean, the information's available. He's just very good at bringing it together about the state of play on 20 or 30 big topics going through the negotiations in the last few days. So there are all sorts of people out there to help you navigate through this. And then there's a very good system for rapid dissemination of comments and judgments from people. So there's an awful lot of near real-time response and analysis of what's going on, which it's quite easy to plug into. And actually, informally, we had at a more informal level, we had a very good, and you should have enjoyed it too, Kiwis at COP28 WhatsApp message group, and I thought it was completely fascinating. And I was following, I was a member of a couple of other message groups outside New Zealand, subject area ones, and I'm not a big social media user. I'm not always glued to my phone, and I wasn't during COP, but it was a really effective way to get a sense of in those from those message groups what was interesting to people, what the general drift of progress was. So for all the size, there is a real immediacy to stuff, and really good communications. But then the other thing is, you actually, we're not negotiators. We don't need to be right up to the minute on all of this stuff. So I think it's also wise just to sort of relax a bit and just really make the most of where you are and what you're doing, rather than being obsessed about, well, I wonder how that, the fossil fuel stuff's going, when are we going to get the next draft language out of the president? But, anyway.
Yeah, I also found it really helpful because New Zealand had daily briefings where you kind of went in for half an hour and they would just talk about a subject, and you could ask all the questions you wanted about that for a little while, and that was to the negotiators, to people involved in the delegation. That was really, really helpful to just get an idea of where we are and what's happening and what they've just been negotiating on recently as well.
Absolutely. Now we've got 6 minutes left, so we'll try and zip through some quick answers on some things. Was there any talk or discussions about China no longer being a developing country? I didn't hear anything particularly, apart from people talking about the G77 plus China, where most of the rest of the G77 is developing countries. Rod, did you hear anything?
No, because China had moved considerably on one really important issue, which helped. At the previous COP, they were very adamant that they were still a developing country and therefore wanted to be a recipient of money under loss and damage. I don't know officially they've changed that view, but that wasn't coming through in this COP. And I think that it's really interesting time for China, because I think at one stage, at one level, there's a lot of confidence there. They're the largest EV producer in the world, and are giving Tesla a real run for Tesla's money in major Western markets. Some of the manufacturers, largest producer of solar panels and wind turbines. So there's confidence there. But on the other hand, the Chinese economy is in getting to be quite a dodgy place in terms of its loss of momentum, its deflation, some horrendous bad news and pressures building up in the financial system, and a government that doesn't seem to know how to respond to turn that around. So I think it was and they're just about to have a change of climate envoy in China, from somebody who's been terrific for 10 years or so and gets on very well with John Kerry, and he and Kerry were very crucial in the last sort of 36 hours, not just working together but helping to get other countries lined up. But Kerry won't last forever. Sorry, don't mean that disrespectfully. I hope he'll keep going for a while, but he's in his late 70s. So China's going to have a change of climate envoy, I think at the end of this year. He's already been chosen, the new person. So that's good. That's renewal. That's a younger person coming through. But no, I think China, I hate to use the word maturing, but in answer to, sorry, it's a long answer to that question. I think China's really stepping up to its role as being wants to be identified as a leader, not get caught up in, are we still a developing country or not?
Yep. Okay, so we've probably got time for another couple of questions. Next one, I guess, will probably be largely for Rod as well, though Kanika might have some views. How do we as Kiwis reconcile the fact that Simon Watts calls the transition away from fossil fuel language included in the stocktake significant, yet the same government is permitting oil and gas exploration in New Zealand again?
It makes no sense at all. they can reverse the ban. And I've got a bet on with a number of people that nobody's going to come to explore, because there are easier, cheaper places to explore, closer, less challenging geology, you know, everything else. We should have enough gas from onshore Taranaki, offshore Taranaki, and though it's not big, the Raglan, the field off Raglan that Todd Energy has been sitting on for a long time, is the size of it, judged now, is pretty small, but there might be more there, and they can develop that because that's grandfathered before the ban on more exploration, and so we're still talking about being far too dependent here on gas as a transition fuel, and you know, the Climate Change Commission has given very good advice on that subject, which the previous government hasn't taken up, nor this, unlikely this one will. Assuming National follows through on this, we will almost certainly be kicked out of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. We're only a second tier member of that. We're not a leader in it. But it would be very embarrassing to be kicked out of that alliance. It's as simple as that. But the way the government's talking now, the new government, it just doesn't see that mismatch, that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, I think also it does affect our reputation on the global scale, because we did actually get the Fossil Award for that on day 3 of COP.
Day 1, yeah.
It was the first one given, I think, yeah.
Yeah, it was the first one given, and it was for that very thing, for lifting the ban. So I think the other countries are taking note, and there are organizations that are trying to bring it to the forefront as well. So hopefully it does change something.
Agreed. Now, one final question, I think, because it's just on 1 o'clock now, but there were a couple of questions around Indigenous peoples. So combine those. Was there much of a focus or a bigger push about the promotion and inclusion of Indigenous peoples in combating climate change issues or sustainability methods, especially in agriculture or marine within New Zealand or developing countries? Rod, I know you were quite interested in the Indigenous elements.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's hugely important, and it's been fascinating to see the IPCC, the UN's climate science body, in successive reports, just bringing more and more Indigenous knowledge and perspective into those reports. And there was good, clear language about that in the cover agreement at the end. So we've got a long way to go, because lots of people, myself included, need to learn an awful lot more about that, and how we can integrate it far more effectively in what we're doing. But there's a real determination, and there's some really interesting countries stepping up around that too, particularly in South America, but far more widely. And again, our Pacific neighbors continue to play, as they have for a long time, a very powerful role. So yeah, this COP did take that on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure about previous COPs, but I definitely saw a huge presence of Indigenous people at this COP, and a lot of the panels that I sat in on had some representations there as well. So I think it was really powerful hearing their own voices being heard on such a global scale. For example, there was this lady from Chad who was talking about how there was some satellite imagery trying to figure out what kind of trees they had in their forest, and they couldn't figure it out with just the imagery, and they had to go and speak to the people on the ground, which meant talking to the Indigenous women, not the men. They tried talking to the men first and didn't get anywhere, because it's actually women in these Indigenous agricultural spaces in developing countries that are doing most of the farming as well. So they are seeing that women and children are going to be affected by climate change more than the men, and in developing countries especially. So I think that is another factor that plays into it, and that is what we're seeing in the Indigenous spaces as well.
Yeah, and gender was brought into it as well, which I won't go into now, but it was really good to see that, you know, lots of different perspectives. So we are 2 minutes past 1. I would like to respect everybody's time. There's some questions that we haven't got to, but we'll try to potentially answer those afterwards, and we'll sort of cover them off and deal with them alongside the recording, hopefully. So thank you so much to both Rod and Kanika for your time. I know you're probably both feeling relatively jet lagged still. I know I am. So hopefully the weekend will help that. But really appreciate your time, your conversation and your perspectives. Look forward to catching up again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you.